The HR Stories podcast is brought to you by the team at HR Stories. The team at HR Stories helps businesses, nonprofits, better manage the employee experience, providing the tools, training, and resources they need to take their organization to the next level. To learn more, go to our website, thehrStoriesTeam.com. Each week on the HR Stories podcast, management and HR consultants Chuck Samicki and John Tallheimer dive into the stories that matter to small business owners, nonprofit leaders, and HR professionals. We continue to be amazed at how companies allow poor decision-making, lack of knowledge, or in some cases, hubris to cause harm to their organization. Each week, we discuss stories where companies must pay large fines, lose great talent, or even stain their reputation within the community. And we tell you how to avoid the same fate. Welcome to the HR Stories podcast, where there is a lesson in every story. On this week's episode, Chuck and John discuss how do we manage our time so we have better outcomes. We hear the story of Julie, who is overwhelmed, and how a bicycle team helps her out. But first, here is what's happening in the HR news.
John, it's good to be here today. Cannot believe it's been a whole week.
It seems like, gosh, we were just talking yesterday, Chuck.
Yeah. Well, folks, my name's Chuck Samicki, and I'm one of the co-storytellers here at the HR Stories podcast. And with me, as you've already heard, is John Tallheimer, my co-storyteller partner and I guess
I love that
brother in arms.
I love that you just hesitated. He died. I don't know. He's here. That's all I know.
I was trying to come up with more of an affectionate term. My brother in arms, my compadre. I don't know, something like that in storytelling and HR-ish, all things HR. And also, John, you've had your first job, right? I remember your first. Do you remember how old you were when your first job?
Well, it depends on if you consider delivering newspapers really badly, if that was my first job or not. And then I was probably 12.
Okay. Well, at least you were 12, almost 13, and then you got probably a regular job when maybe you were 16. Most people do around 16 or so.
Yeah, it might have been a little later than that. 18, 17, 18.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, you're a late bloomer. That's fine. Well, you know what? You obviously are not. No, it's okay. You know, some people, they take their time. They're late bloomers, but not these. But I got to tell you, I read about some kids in the news this week, 10 years old, working at McDonald's. You talk about industrious. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I heard that story. Right? That's crazy to have 10-year-olds working in a McDonald's restaurant. And if I remember the story right, Chuck, they were actually working the night shift up to 2 a.m.
Yeah, that's the crazy thing. So, folks, we're talking about Louisville, Kentucky, or Louisville, right? Louisville, Kentucky. And the Department of Labor went in and they assessed 3 McDonald's franchisees and said that they had 2 10-year-olds that they employed but did not pay and allowed them to work until 2 a.m., preparing and distributing orders, cleaning the restaurant, working the drive-through window. Could you imagine driving up as a 10-year-old kid giving you your food and use the register? But get this, they had them operate the deep fryer, which normally, as we know, due to OSHA, is a task off limits for those under a certain age. And out of 305 minors at these restaurants, 2 of them were 10 years old.
Yeah, so there's over 300 minors working at these restaurants. So people under the age of 18, probably 16 in this particular case, that were working at a restaurant right? And so there are Department of Labor has certain laws, child labor laws, and every state has child labor laws. And so paying attention to that is critical. And the Department of Labor has done a big survey on this, Chuck, and they found that there was a crackdown. No, there was an increase of 69% of kids being employed illegally since 2018.
Wow.
And 835 companies had employed more than 3,800 children illegally. And that's one of their investigations, right?
Yeah.
It's just kind of crazy.
I remember a story a couple months ago with Kia and Hyundai Auto Parts dealership or manufacturer employing 13, 14, and 15-year-old workers, which, I can understand, even a young kid, mom works in the office. It's Saturday. You want to go in, you can, I don't know, staple things for me and I'll give you $10, 10-year-old kid, 11-year-old kid, an hour or two. I don't know how legal that is, but I've seen that before. And when I was 14 and 15, my father would take me in. He was a garage mechanic, and he'd go on Saturdays, and I'd go in and I'd sweep the floors in the dealership, and I'd wash cars. I was 14, 15 years old. But at least I was a teenager. This 10-year-old thing, I don't get it. And they were working till 2 a.m.
Yeah. I mean, that's just ridiculous. And here's the thing, and here's what I've been looking at, Chuck, right? Because I do think, and it just came out today, right? The new labor thing's out, and 250,000 jobs were added again in the month of April. And so there's jobs, right? There's jobs out there. Unemployment is 3.5% or 3.4%. For Blacks in America, I think it went down to 4.7%, which is amazingly much better. And so, right, so there's all this unemployment. I mean, there's all this employment going on. And I think there is this strain on businesses because they can't find good workers, right? They can't find people to do their jobs, and they can't find them. And so I think what's happening is, well, I'm going to do this because it's the least risky thing that I can do. I'm going to bring in an 11-year-old. I'm going to bring in a 10-year-old. And that 10-year-old was getting paid. They weren't there because it was fun, but they were probably being paid under the table, right? And so kind of going through that and seeing all that, I think I don't think this is going to go away. I don't think the shortage of good workers is going away.
Mm-hmm. Sure. What else you got in the news, John? Anything else?
I got one other story. Another thing that popped in my head here is that in the labor report and the number of employees, they found that 46,000 employees have left the workforce in the month of April, right? And so that's trending up. And what we're finding is a lot of the baby boomers are leaving the workforce, right? They're retiring. They're leaving the workforce. And so we're going to see more of that. Now, more millennials and more Generation Zs may come into the workforce now. We're starting to see them come in, but not at the as big numbers. So I think we all need to kind of sit back and go, okay, what do we need to do to kind of figure out the labor market? And money is definitely an answer. The annual rate that employees get has gone up a little bit. And so that's good for employees, maybe not as good for companies, but it's good for employees, and just trying to figure all that out. But I do think, which kind of leads to a story that you were talking about, Chuck. So let's go there. You heard a story where people were trying to attract people to the workplace, but not necessarily pay them. What was going on there?
Yeah, so the headline is, with compensation budgets tight, employers turn to titles to entice. And so the story is that companies are increasingly relying on job titles to attract, retain, and reward talent. And that's a strategy that's been used in the past in the pre-pandemic timeframes, but it's gone up. There's been a jump in that to where companies now are giving titles out. Higher titles, maybe, oh, you were the director, but now you're the senior director, or you were a manager, now you're a senior manager, now you're a director, now you're a VP, senior VP, that sort of thing. Because number one, they say that they can't afford more money, but they're giving bigger titles. And maybe with the title comes maybe little perks. Who knows? But also, the interesting thing is, they're finding that there's a generational thing, that a younger generational, and I wasn't able to get a specific age range there,
right,
but the younger generational groups are looking for better titles because they see their friends at a younger age maybe excelling in their career with a bigger title. So there's a lot of title envy going on, perhaps.
Well, I guess that's always been out there. I can think back to my career and somebody had like director of da da da, and I'm like, oh no, I don't have that title, and blah blah blah, right? And I guess I probably, if I think about it seriously, I probably envisioned that there was perks and money going with it. But it does help when you go and do that job jumping, right? You get that title. Well, I was director of operations. And then you go to interview this company and you're like, well, that sounds a lot better than I was a manager of operations, or I managed the operations, right? And so it's an interesting way to do it. I don't know what the value of that is long-term, right? I get the title, that gets me there, but what does that mean going long-term?
Right. And a lot of the experts have said the same thing. They said, it can be a tool to use, but you can't rely on it as a strong retention tool. And eventually you need to back it up with some sort of pay increase.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I think the thing that we need to look at also is, how do we attract those individuals? And a lot of times we can't do pay, right? The other thing that I would say is, and we talk about this a lot in my classes, is that the best employees are already working, right? So they're working at somebody else's company, and it's your job to go find them and bring them across. And it's going to be interesting to see how I was driving home today, and I drove by like 4 or 5 different restaurants in our area, and every one of them had now hiring. We pay this much. Come to our workplace. And so it's going to be interesting how the restaurant business deals with that, the shortage of workers.
Yeah. Yeah. And I will tell you, and we'll wind up with this, because I don't want to, I think we made our point, but here in Orlando, and I'm sure in Nashville there, I constantly read in the Orlando Business Times, Orlando Business Journal, or I drive new restaurant chain coming to town, new hotels building. And I'm thinking, did you folks not do any type of assessment of the labor market? There are no folks to work these places, right, yet they're continuing to build, and staff, and even offering fairly high pay rates for these types of jobs. They can't find anyone. So it just blows me away. And we've had a couple restaurants in our part of town, and I live in an area of Orlando. It's kind of closer to downtown. It's a nice area, but some restaurants have closed because they can't find people.
Well, I mean, the challenge in Nashville is the cost of living is going way up, and the individuals need more money to live in Nashville, or otherwise they're leaving and they're going to places like Clarksville, Mount Juliet, right? And so now they're in those places and they're working there. Like, why would I travel to downtown Nashville when I can get a job in my hometown of Clarksville or Mount Juliet, right? And so lots of crazy stuff going on there. I have one more story. It's an important story, Chuck, that if you don't mind, I'd like to do before we go to break. I know you're like, oh, I need to get to the break, but let me just dive into this story here. And so we all know that the National Labor Relations Board, if we should know anyway, that the National Labor Relations Board really oversees the union side of the business, right? They really work with that relationship between unions and employers and unions and employees and that kind of stuff. Well, they just recently released a decision where they threw out a Trump-era decision that had made it easier for employers to discipline workers who make profane, harassing, or discriminatory comments in the course of a workplace dispute, right? And so in that workplace dispute, it was at the time, if they were belligerent, harassing somebody, it was very easy to dismiss them. Well, they brought back what they called, let me get the right name here, they called it the Atlantic Steel decision. And so they're back to that, going back to that in there. And so what happened was there was a case from 2017 where an employee at the Texas-based synthetic rubber manufacturing was disciplined and ultimately fired after he had gotten into a heated exchange with the managers about the working conditions. So he was complaining to them about the working conditions, and maybe the manager said, that's the way we do it here. And he started yelling and screaming. And so he was then fired for that yelling and screaming. What happened was this went all the way up to the National Labor, well, went up to the courts, and the courts threw it to the National Labor Relations Board. And what they had what the company had expected was that they were going to win that, but the National Labor Relations Boards, no, like that's protected speech. When it comes to workplace disputes, they're allowed to have those conversations.
Interesting. So, plus, the workplace dispute was about job safety.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it was. I mean, it was about job safety. It was about workplace conditions. And so that's what they were dealing with, right? And so they wanted, again, if you're in a terrible working condition and you're having an argument with your boss about it, there seems to be you need to give that person some leeway to express their frustration around safety concerns. And so here's what the Atlantic Steel, this is what they'll be looking at going forward, because it goes back to the Atlantic Steel decision. It says, in determining whether an employee's conduct during Section 7 activities, right? So talking about workplace conditions, loses that protection of the act, the board considers the following four things: the place of the discussion, so where was the discussion, the subject matter of the discussion, the nature of the employee's outbursts, and then whether the outburst was in any way provoked by the employer's unfair labor practices, right? So if somebody, like an employee comes in and starts screaming at you, you can fire that person. But if they're coming and you're having a conversation about working conditions or salary, and they get a little irate, I would think twice before we go ahead and fire that person.
Yeah, or use a little profanity because they're very upset.
Right, yeah.
I gotcha. But so before this, it was like, oh, you used profanity, you were disrespectful, we're firing you for that.
Correct, yeah.
Gotcha. Great story.
Yeah, so I think
a couple of great stories to kick off
the
main story today. Are we going to have time for the main story today?
Well, I think we're going to have time. So how much time do we have today for the episode?
We might have about 30-ish or so minutes, I guess. I don't know. Let me take a look, because I don't know if sometimes I'm just always running behind. I got to, keep things straight, John. I need to rearrange things on my desk. I don't know what's important or not sometimes.
Hey, let's do this. Let's do this. While you're thinking about that, let's take a break, and then we'll come back and I'll dive into the story, and we're going to talk a little bit about time management today. Chuck was just playing with you, but we're going to take a quick break here, and then we're going to come back and talk about time management, a topic that probably is on all of our radar right now, and managing that time. You have been listening to the HR Stories podcast, where there is a lesson in every story.
Hello, listeners. I have some questions for you. Do you find yourself struggling with HR and employment issues? Are you afraid you could make the wrong employment decision that will cost your company thousands or even millions of dollars? Maybe you're new to the world of HR, or you've been in HR for a while and you just wish you had one resource, a guide to help you get HR right. Well, I've got good news for you. The team at HR Stories is excited to announce a new comprehensive resource, the Ultimate Book of HR Checklists. We created the Ultimate Book of HR Checklists as a simple, step-by-step resource guide packed with 70 downloadable checklists and other resources that help small businesses and organizations get human resources right. Even with very little HR or management experience, you can get instant results with concise, practical steps for addressing many of your tough employment issues. Do not miss out. Go to hrchecklist.com to learn more. That's hrchecklists with an S.com to learn more. And as always, thanks for listening to the HR Stories podcast, where the lesson is always in the story. This is the HR Stories podcast, where there's a lesson in every story. And if we have time, there could be 2 or 3 lessons. I'm not exactly sure.
Oh, come on, Chuck. You know, you're the program manager here. Samantha, I think we need some help. If you could help us here, get on there.
Samantha's our producer. We love Samantha.
Samantha's great.
And you'll see a picture of Samantha on our brand new website that should be out about now.
Wait.
As you're listening to this.
I thought that was a secret. Are we allowed to announce that? Samantha, are we allowed to announce the new website? Oh, we are. Okay. Samantha says it's okay. Whew. I was like, I didn't know. You guys I'm not in the loop. So here's my question for you, Chuck. Have you ever thought how valuable time is?
I don't really have enough time to think about that, but when I do, I feel it. I feel how valuable time is.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The clock is ticking.
Right. And it depends, right? But there's sometimes, man, 60 seconds can change somebody's life, right? And so time can be very valuable. Yesterday, I had the chance and I was going through our Facebook community, our HR Team of One community Facebook page. And I realized that a lot of the comments and a lot of the questions were about how do I better manage my time? In fact, with my work with executive managers and supervisors, one of the number one complaints I hear is, how do I get this all done and still lead a normal life, right? It's something I don't know. I've struggled with that in my career, Chuck, chasing that work-life balance. When I was in corporate America, I probably worked between 50 to 60 hours every week on a normal week. That was just what I did. And I really still struggle to keep up with the work life and have that life outside of work.
Yeah. Well, look, for me, outside of any ADD or ADHD issues, let's remove that. I have done at times what would be the word? Sometimes I'm great at it. Sometimes I'm not so great at it. Sometimes I get distracted. But I do realize at this point in time, there are certain, like this morning I got up and I'm thinking, what do I need to work on? Well, I need to think about what are things that, that perhaps will help bring in some revenue. Okay, maybe I should work on just revenue things first, then other projects later. When I was an HR director, I used to break things down, John, by what are things that can get me arrested? So I better do those first. What are things that could get me fired, right? So I better do those second. And then third, what are things that are just basically going to get me in trouble? And so if I had trouble or figuring out what I needed to do, I put them in those boxes there.
I can see your desk now. I can see your workstation, and you have like these 3 boxes or maybe 4 boxes in front of you. Will that cause me to be arrested? Yes. Work on that. No. Will that cause me to be fired? Work on that. Yes. No. Will that help protect the organization? Yes, right? And so will that make employee engagement happen, right? Okay, yeah, now I'm going to get down into that there. Maybe not the best way to manage our time.
Right.
I
but
like
can
it. I
time
understand
be,
it.
But can time be managed? Can
Well,
it actually be managed?
No, I mean, it's not time that we manage. It's ourselves, right? It's our priorities. It's our energies. It's our focus. And I spend a lot of time in that class. In fact, yesterday I was having a conversation with one of my coaching clients, and he's being promoted to the partner on his company. Pretty good, right? Great deal.
Yeah.
Right. And so that new high level position comes with an increased level of responsibility. And his concern in the conversation we had over the coaching thing is, how is he going to get all that done? Right? How do I get all that done within the allotted time to do that? And we really had some strategic, because I was really concerned, and I see this a lot in first-time supervisors or even people that have been managing for a long time, is they don't set their own boundaries. And so they get into 50-hour, 60-hour work weeks. And then they're like, how do I get out of that? Right? How do I do that? Right? And so I don't know. I mean, again, think about that, listeners, for yourself. Have you ever been in that situation? You're like, oh my God, I'm just overwhelmed. Or you're like, Chuck, I'm not sure where to start today. I don't know what to do. According to an article called Changes in America, in 1965, about 50% of workers in America took breaks. Today, it's less than 5%. And
oh my gosh.
So go ahead. Sorry, Chuck.
No, I'm like shocked by that number. I mean, that's wow, what a statistic.
Yeah. In fact, what's happening now is our leisurely activities are much more planned. Like, we're putting them into our schedule. Well, this morning I need to meditate, and then I need to nap, and then I need to relax. Right? We're putting them into a schedule, and that relax and spontaneous is not really happening there. So, Chuck, I want to share a story today that I heard from a friend. And to be honest, we hear this type of story a lot with the clients we work with, whether that's a coaching client or an organization or an HR director. We hear this story a lot. So Julie, this is not her real name, was the head of a human resources for a company with about 325 employees, and it's continuing to grow. It's a great company. It's continuing to grow. She was officially, I think, the chief people officer, and her job was to ensure that the company was properly staffed, manage employees' benefits, compensation was done, handle any of those employee relationships, all the stuff that we know HR people do. It was a hard job. And she had a small team, but it was hard for them to keep the company compliant with employment laws, right? The things that we might get arrested for or fired for. Keeping hiring right, ensure that benefits supported their staff while not paying too much, right? That tension in there. Handling all the employee relationships was that row. And so typically she was working 50 hours a week, which wasn't sitting well with her family. So one day she was talking to the CEO, who asked her, she was a one-on-one with the CEO, right? Getting that caught up time, know what's going on. The CEO asked Julie if she had a chance to write up the strategic plan for the human resources department. Julie had not even thought about it, right? She was like, oh, right. Have you ever, Chuck, let me ask you this. Have you ever been in with a client or with a CEO and you're maybe as an HR director and they ask you something and you've completely forgotten about it?
No.
What?
No, really? That happens?
Yeah.
I've heard stories of that. I got to really think about that. Maybe, John, like sometimes, even now with you, sometimes there are things that I need to get to that I should. I've gotten better. But yes, okay. There have been times I'm sitting there and all of a sudden, boom. And it's like you feel like you should be in a dream that you should be waking up from, and you're not. Yeah. And it's horrifying.
That's right. Right. Maybe your business partner asked if you read the script before the podcast. And those kind of things. Chuck, you remember those kind of things? Maybe you forgot. Right?
There's
And
no
so,
script.
right? And she had been
script.
I didn't hear what you said. I was mumbling.
There's no script. There's no script.
Oh, yeah, no, there's a totally, right? Right? And so Julie had completely forgot about this, right? Had completely forgotten. She'd been so busy dealing with those urgent matters, right? What we call fires at work. She had forgotten to do it. She admitted this to the CEO and said she would work over it the weekend and have it on the CEO's desk Monday morning. And the CEO responded like this. No, you won't. Julie, he says to her, it's Easter weekend.
Yeah.
Julie sat there looking at the CEO with tears in her eyes and started stuttering. And the CEO said, wait a minute. You are doing an amazing job, Julie. You are one of the best HR professionals I have worked with, but I'm worried about your health. You are consistently working more than 50 hours a week. Your team is working almost 50 hours a week. This can't continue. Julie stuttered, but Julie, her boss calls out, her name faded as the CEO looked at her. I love your passion for wanting to do the job well and not letting me or your team down. But I don't want to burn yourself out or your team out. And Julie responded, I don't know what to do. And so the CEO reached out to Julie and said, look, do you know the story of the British bicycle team? And Julie said, no. In 2003, her CEO continued, the top bike manufacturer had refused to sell the British cycling team bikes because, quite honestly, they sucked. They hadn't won a major event in years. No one respected them in this industry. And so they were at a loss. They didn't know what to do. So they hired a new coach called David Brailsford. It was his responsibility to get the team right back on track. He brought in a new strategy that he referred to as the aggregation of marginal gains. Julie looked at her CEO and said, what?
What?
It's a mouthful, right? The aggregation of marginal gain is the concept that if we look at everything we do and improve it by a teeny margin, it will have a major impact on our organization. The British cycling team started looking at everything they did and tried to improve it by 1%. They redesigned the bike seats to make them more comfortable. They put rubbing alcohol on the tires for a better grip. They even looked, and this is all my favorite part of the story, they even looked at the massage gels to see which led to the fastest muscle recovery. They determined for each bicyclist on their team which pillow and mattress was best for them.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
Right? Then the way it goes, this is Chuck, to check this out. This is a detail. They even painted the inside of all their trucks white so they could reduce the amount of dust on their bikes. Because, in inside of a black truck or a dark truck, you can't see the dust.
Sure.
And so they wanted to make sure that they're, right? And so Julie's looking at the CEO, right? Going, okay, that sounds great, but it also sounds like it. And he said, yes, but it's worth it. And what happened was the British cycling team goes in, does all these things, ends up winning like every single gold medal for the next 5 years, winning the Tour de France, I think 7 out of the 6 next years, really just became the number one cycling team in the world, right? So it really was there. And Julie was sitting there talking to her CEO, and she goes, are you asking me to revamp my whole department? And I love what the CEO said here. The CEO said this: no, I'm giving you permission to change the department so it better serves us and doesn't burn out the team. So Julie looked at her boss, right, and knew something had to change. She felt a little bit more optimistic at the end of this. She felt she was a little bit better. Her boss said, your overall arching goal should be to reduce your team's weekly hour rate to a manageable level while at the same time holding to your high standards of delivery. So Julie starts seeing this path forward. And she says, so I mean my team and I need to see how we create more efficient in our work. CEO's like, yep, that is your thing. That's what you need to do. Now, Julie was excited, right? Because no boss had ever given her permission to change her department. She felt like, well, I need to be doing all these same things. And so she leaves the boss's CEO's office, calls her team together and say, look, we have permission to change our department so it works better for us and better for the teams on there. Mm-hmm. So the team talked a little bit. Yeah. It's kind of
smarter. Work smarter, not harder in a way. Because a lot of times you think, I just need to work more hours, harder. And you're not. You're not becoming any more efficient.
Yeah. And again, there's all these time management studies when we look at them where productivity after about 6.5 hours drops off hard, right? And so you put in 7 hours, 8 hours, 10 hours in a day, those last couple hours, your productivity is probably about 50% of what it was first thing in the morning when you had your energy, you were going and kind of doing that. And so doing that there, right? And so the team got together and they talked a little bit about the possibilities and they decided that they were all going to go back and brainstorm over the next week and get together in there. So Julie comes back to her office and there was still something bothering her. And she knew the workload wasn't right. The workload wasn't going to change, right? That amount of work was there. And if she and her team didn't get better at time management skills, they were not going to be able to increase the workload, not manage the workload any better. So she picked up the phone and called the one person she knew could help her. The phone rings. On the other line is her dad, who said, Julie, how are you, Dad? I need your help. I need to manage my time better. Her dad laughed, right? Because he knew this was a challenge with her, right? She could hear the smile on his face. Dad. And he says, do you know who Dwight Eisenhower was? And she responded, an old guy.
Yeah, right, right.
Right? And he says, yes, and a dead one for that fact. But he was also our 34th president. And before that, he was a commanding general in World War II. After the war, he gave a speech saying, I have two kinds of problems, the urgent and the important. The urgent are not important, and the important are never urgent. And this is the foundation of modern time management.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And so she asked, how do I use it? And I love what her dad responds to. He says, go to Google and look up Eisenhower Matrix, right? And the dad was like, go up there, you look it up. I'm not going to spend. But he gives her some more information. He says, look, there are 4 quadrants in the Eisenhower Matrix. The first is what we call the urgent and important. This is the crisis stuff. This is the stuff that you have to do. You're in crisis mode. You need to get it done. Sometimes we put things in crisis mode because we haven't done anything to plan for that event, right? And so sometimes we're causing the crisis ourselves. The second quadrant, it's where the important things are, but not the urgent. This is what Eisenhower called the planning quadrant. This is where we do that strategic planning, right? Chuck, and you and I always talk about strategic planning and thinking about what we want to do. And for me, I always use this as an example of strategic planning. It's what we need to do today to prepare for tomorrow, the next week, the week after that.
Sure. Okay. I like this. It's like my boxes.
Yeah, kind of like your boss. Yeah, different labels, but like your boss, right? The third is not important, but urgent. This is what we call the delegation quadrant, where we're going to delegate that to somebody. Maybe somebody on your team. Maybe for Department of One, our Department of One HR people that are here today, This is the quadrant that you use and you delegate it to the managers. Give them that responsibility so they can handle it, because they're going to be able to do it. And some, depending on what it is, they may be able to do it better than you because they have that closer relationship with the employee. Yeah. And so this is what we call the delegate. And so the last one, the last quadrant, is the not important and not urgent. And this is the stuff we should stop doing. And I will challenge everybody that's listening to this podcast. I can guarantee 100% there are stuff that your organization is doing that you should not be doing. It's not adding any value to your company at all. And so every task, right, going back to the 1%, right, the marginal gains, if we can cut those things out, we're going to be much more effective. So Julie and her dad kind of wrap up that conversation. And she goes, why haven't I never heard of it? And he goes, look, when I used it after the military, I used it a lot in the hospitality thing, right? And Julie started realizing that she's going to have to take this Eisenhower Matrix and present it to her whole team, right? And maybe the whole company, because if they can improve their effectiveness by just 1%, right? Just by 1%, they can get better. And so this, at the end of the story, Julie's like, I finally got some control back, right? And that's what we want. I think a lot of times when we're feeling overwhelmed, what we don't like is we feel out of control.
Yeah, or we want to go take a nap.
Yeah, that's
you know, the aggregate of
marginal gains. Yeah.
Marginal gains. So it's funny you bring this up, because I can think in various leadership positions that I've been in where the team was wasting a lot of time doing things they didn't need to do. And I'll give you an example. I'm the manager of staffing at Universal Studios in Orlando. I've got 21 recruiters working for me and coordinators. And that was back before we had a lot of online hiring. And we were going through a huge expansion. We were adding a new theme park called Islands of Adventure and nighttime entertainment called City Walk. We had to hire 3,000 employees. Back in those days, we were interviewing about 3 to 1, right? So almost 10,000 people we had to interview, and it was crazy. John, wow. Everything was paper, and everything was white paper. So if you can imagine, not only were the applications were on white paper, everything's on white paper. Their files were backed up to sort. We lost applications like crazy, right? Like you wouldn't believe. Someone came in. Oh, have you seen the application? We spent.
I want to interrupt you because I just want you to see the visual that I'm seeing, Chuck. So I see you sitting in a hotel conference room with just stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks of paper and somebody trying to figure out what's going on with every one of them.
Yeah, this is an HR department with maybe 10 offices, maybe 15 cubicles, a storage area, a coffee area, a back storage area, and stacks of rubber banded, file this, file that. And everyone's running around looking for the white application, right, that has someone's name on it. And, it was horrendous. So I said, I don't know how I did this, but at one point in time, I needed to make copy of something. And I used light yellow paper. And I know what it was. I wanted to change the color of the application. And the records department, see, we were big enough, we had a records department too. Yeah. They said, no, everything has to be white. I'm like, Audrey Sue, if you're ever listening to this, you know what I'm talking about. And so one day, John, and this is a great story in a way. I know it's longer, but I'm making a copy of something, and someone had given me something. It was a pale yellow paper, and I had to make a copy. And when the copy came out, it was white paper, but it was clear. Like you couldn't. It wasn't gray. It wasn't hazy.
Oh, interesting.
It was crystal clear. So I was like, eureka. So to this day, and I still have got, I had them put in every employment application, universal, during that time period was yellow for years. And I remember years later, someone once said, why do we have yellow applications? Well, let me tell you the story. And that was it. So no matter what, no matter where you looked in this office area, it was a giant office area. If you saw something yellow, even in a stack like that, you knew there was an application in there. So boom, we saved so much time on looking for applications. That's my story that goes along with your story.
Yeah, that is a brilliant example. I love that example of figuring out what's the one thing that we can do to increase that, right? What is that one thing we can do to increase it by just 1%, right? Yeah. And so, and it's so important, right? Kind of doing that on there is just so important on there, right? That aggregation of marginal gains is so important. In fact, I was thinking about this on the way to recording this today. I think the challenge here is not necessarily how do I improve that by 1%, but capturing everything that you do and how do I capture all those by 1%. And so I love the story about the British Bicycle and Company or a team, because they looked at every little last thing that would impact their effectiveness, right? The massage gel, the seats, the tires, the type of bicycles, the weight of the bicycles, the uniforms, right? They looked at all of those things to see what's going to improve their effectiveness. Now, there were times they made decisions and they're like, okay, that's not working for us. Right. And they would have to go back, right? And so, again, I love your example because I think that's a perfect example of that marginal gains, right?
Yeah, and we never lost another application. And if we did, we just had to look for a yellow piece of paper laying in a pile somewhere and we would find it. So John, listen, I know we're coming to the end and there's so much here to share, but you've mentioned 2 tools. Can you remind us again what those were?
Yeah. And so the one we were just talking about is what we call the 1% solution, right? And so the 1% solution, right, is the ability to look at every single task that we do and improve it by 1%. Now, some people take this farther, right? And they say, well, you know what? I'm going to improve it today by 1%. And then next week, I'm going to improve it by 1%. And then the week after that, right? And so then we have what we call that compounding interest that over time really improves it. But what we're saying here is if you look at every single task that you do, improve it by 1, 2, or 3%, then you're going to have a major impact overall. I have to say that story comes from a book called The Atomic Habit by James Clear. And so I would definitely recommend that book to everybody. It is a wonderful book to tap into to do that.
Sure.
And then the second tool that I mentioned was what we call the Eisenhower Matrix, right? This was made popular by Stephen Covey. And what it is it's just a different way to process the stuff that ends up on our desk, right? So when it comes on our desk, we should go, okay, is that urgent? Is it important? Do I need to take care of it right now? Is it urgent, but not important? Do I need to delegate that? Is it something that's urgent? I mean, something that's important, but not urgent. And should I put that in my planning quadrant? One of the things that I have found very much a lot of success for all my clients, whether that's a executive person or a manager, is putting strategic planning time on your calendar. Start with a half an hour. Start with an hour every week and say, all right, this hour, I'm going to be thinking about what I need to do next month. What are those actions I need to take for next month? Not for now, not for this week, but what do I need, right? Because we're coming up with a lot of different things in the HR world that we may want to think about planning for and doing all those things. So lots of great, both of those tools, I would highly recommend doing that.
Yeah, and as the team of HR at HR Stories, we do offer opportunities for you as listeners to gain some of your time back. There are services we offer, things that we can do to help you become more successful in your organization.
Yeah, and so we have a 3-hour and a 6-hour time management courses. We've taught this to executives. We've taught this to managers and supervisors. We've talked it down to your employees, right? And so we would love to come in your organization and help your organization improve its effectiveness through better time management, better priority management, we should really say.
Yeah. And so the key here, and this is one of the things I learned by reading Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, by reading the Atomic Habits book by James Clear, is you cannot manage time, but you can manage yourself.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good, really final thought, Chuck, I think. It's about us, right? It's about how we respond and knowing what our priorities are, right? And I love Chuck's priority buckets, even though they're kind of silly, but they're really good. What do I need to do, right? What are my priorities for the day? What's not going to get me arrested? What's not going to get me fired? What's not going to get me in trouble, right? And so, but also in that, we need that planning. What do I need to do today so I don't get in trouble, arrested 6 months from now, right? And so again, thinking strategically also is a really kind of important part. And I guess I'm going to sum that up right there as my final thought for the day. What else you got, Chuck?
That's all, folks. Like, comment, and subscribe. Don't forget to check out our Facebook page. It is a free resource, the HR Team of One community. We've got big news we're going to be announcing next week about a membership program where you can join the team at HR Stories and get, behind the podcast, besides the podcast, there are resources that we can offer that we're going to be sharing this membership program. It's very exciting. I just can't wait to talk about it. In fact, I can't wait to talk about it so much, I am talking about it. So, folks, thanks for listening to the HR Stories podcast. Yeah. Thanks for listening, folks.
Samantha. Cut them off.
Where there's a lesson in every start.
Thank you guys for listening today. We do really appreciate it. Don't forget to like. Don't forget to, put your comments in our things. The more you comment, the more you like, the better we're perceived out in the world. The more people we'll reach. And that's our goal, to reach as many small businesses, HR professionals as possible. So please make sure that you're doing that. We will see you next week, where there'll be a lesson in the story. Thank you for listening to the HR Stories podcast. The material presented in this podcast is for informational purposes only. Chuck and John always recommend using an employment lawyer or HR consultant to handle any legal concerns or HR issues. We do our best to double check sources and make sure the information we are providing is accurate. We may eliminate or embellish without changing the basic narrative to make the story easier to understand. In certain circumstances, we may change identifying information to protect the innocent. The HR Stories broadcast is brought to you by the team at HR Stories. The team at HR Stories is designed to help anyone with HR responsibilities be better at managing the employee experience. To engage with us, go to the hrstoriesteam.com and learn more about how the team at HR Stories can support your business or nonprofit. Thank you for listening to the HR Stories podcast, where there is a lesson in every story.